So I'm going to need you to follow me on this so that you can understand. Here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, it says, "You have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." When people see lust, or see the word lust in the context of a man lusting after a woman, they think of sexual desire. So if we take this scripture at face value, then it would mean that even if a man looks at his own wife with sexual desire, aka lust, then he is committing adultery with her in his heart, which means his mind, because it says woman, and your wife is a woman. So that would mean that virtually no one can ever have sex, because if a man desires his woman sexually, that would be adultery. The Greek word being used here, that's translated as woman, is the Greek word gune, which is basically the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word isha. And what does it mean? What does this word mean? It means woman, and you can also say wife. For those who don't know, in Hebrew, there is no specific word for wife. It is the word isha in Hebrew, which means woman. But if it's a woman that belongs to a man because she is in the covenant of marriage with a man, then that's his woman, his isha, or we would say his wife. So again, the Greek word being used here that's translated as woman is the Greek word gune. So here it is, the Greek word gune. And as it says here, it's translated as women or wife. There's no difference. It says here, a woman of any age, whether virgin or married or a widow, a wife of a betrothed woman, a woman, especially a wife, woman. So when we're speaking about lust, lust simply means to desire something that is unlawful, something that you're not supposed to have. So to lust after a woman means to want another man's wife. Remember that for the Hebrews, there is no difference between the word wife and the word woman. As it says here in Exodus 20:17, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife," etc., etc., the things that belong to your neighbor. And when it says wife, that's Isha. Don't covet your neighbor's woman. Now, to covet and to lust is the same thing. That's very important to understand. So why is it a sin here in this verse to desire these things? It's because they belong to someone else. That's why. In fact, the word being used in Matthew 5:28, that's translated here as lust, is the Greek word epithemia. And it's the same exact word that the Apostle Paul uses in Romans chapter 7, verse 7. But in that verse, it's translated as covet. Why? Because as I already said, covet and lust is the same thing. To covet and to lust is the same thing. This is Romans chapter 7, verse 7. It says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust," watch this, "except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet." The word translated as covet here is the Greek word epithemia. And we're going to look at that word in a minute here. It's the Greek word epithemia, and it's translated as covet. The same exact word here is translated as lust. And what is the Apostle Paul talking about? He's talking about the 10th commandment. That's why he said, I had not known sin but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. And where is he getting that from? He's getting that from the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet. That's where he's getting this from. And as you see here, it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Why? Because she belongs to someone else. And again, the same word Paul used is the same word Christ is using here. That's translated as lust. So Paul is referring to the 10th commandment, which says not to covet, and we can say / lust after another man's woman or wife. The word really just means to desire, but when you are desiring something unlawfully, we will call it lust. There's nowhere in the Bible where having multiple wives is said to be a sin, so desiring multiple wives is not lust. And the reason why you're an adulterer for coveting or lusting after another man's wife is because the seed of adultery is planted and begins to grow in your mind. So you're already an adulterer, although you may have not gone forth and gone through with the act physically yet. Just like here in 1 John 3:15, it says, whosoever hateth his brother is a murderer. So you don't have to physically carry out a murder to be a murderer. It's because the seed of murder is already planted in your mind when you hate your brother in your mind and in your heart. That's why it says here in 1 John 3:15 that if you just hate your brother, you are a murderer. The Hebrew word that's used in the 10th commandment that's translated as covet is the Hebrew word kamad. That's the Hebrew word being used here. Kamad. This is the Hebrew word being used, kamad, and it means to desire. But when used in a negative context, it means to covet, or we could say lust. Hopefully you can understand that. Here it says, to delight in, beauty, greatly beloved, covet, delectable thing, delight, desire, goodly, lust, pleasant, precious thing. So again, it just means to desire, but in a negative context, it means to lust or to covet. That's the Hebrew word being used in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17 for the 10th commandment. Here is the Greek word that Christ and the Apostle Paul used. In Matthew 5:28, it says lust in English. In Romans 7, verse 7, it says covet in English. But it's actually the Greek word epithemio. And it says here, it's translated as desire, covet, lust, lust after, feign. So again, it just means to desire, but in a negative context, it would mean lust or covetousness. And then it says to turn upon a thing, to have a desire for, long for, to desire, to lust after, covet, of those who seek things forbidden. It says to set the heart upon, i.e., long for, rightfully or otherwise. That means it can be a righteous desire or an unrighteous desire. It just depends on if it's lawful or not. Covet, desire, would, feign, lust after. Apostle Paul in Romans 7:7 says that he would not have known sin but by the law, for he would not have known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. The word for covet is the Greek word epithemio, and he's talking about the 10th commandment. Remember, what we call the New Testament is written in Greek, so that's why this word is Greek. In Hebrew, we already went over what the word is in Hebrew, which is hamad. We already went over that. So that's what he's saying, covet. And that's the same exact word that Christ used here when it says lust. Talking about looking on a woman, or you could say wife, to lust after her. You could say covet. And why is that a sin? Because she already belongs to someone else. That's what we just read here in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. You shall not covet thy neighbor's wife. Hamad. You see it being used again here in Proverbs chapter 6. In verse 25, it says, lust not after her beauty in thine heart. And that's the same Hebrew word, hamad. You could say covet not after her beauty. Neither let her take thee with her eyelids. And it's going to explain why. It's going to explain more. It says, for by means of a whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress will hunt for the precious life. So she's an adulteress. She belongs to another man. It's important to understand that. That's why to desire her is lust or covetousness. So that's what Christ is talking about when he's speaking about adultery. And he says that if you look on this woman to covet or to lust after her, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. And as I already said, to lust after a woman is to lust after another man's woman or wife, because you're not supposed to have her, because she's already married. And if Christ was literally saying that it's a sin for a man to desire a woman sexually at all, then it would be a sin for a man to desire his own wife. Because again, this word means desire, this Greek word being used here, epithemia. But in a negative context, we say lust. Just like hamad, covet, this word means desire. But in a negative context, it's covet or lust. If a man's motives were driven by lust, he would engage in sexual relations with women in an unlawful manner, perhaps even resorting to relationships with prostitutes without any intention of assuming responsibility or committing to them as their husband. However, seeking biblically lawful wives with the desire to lead, to love, and to be devoted to them for a lifetime does not fall under the category of lust. Calling polygynous men lustful is highly ignorant and demonstrates a lack of understanding. I'll give you a real life example of why. I have a friend who I teach with who is not from the United States that wants to have a large family with multiple wives. His grandfather also had multiple wives. Now, to call him lustful is absurd and unfounded because he has not had sex in over 5 years and he refuses to have sex until he is properly under a covenant with a woman. He is literally one of the most sexually restrained men that I know. Recently, he's been courting a woman and teaching her about the biblical and Hebraic way of life, and he has refused to have sex with her despite her advances. And this is just one example. I can honestly affirm that some of the polygynous men that I know are some of the most sexually restrained men that I know. But unfortunately, individuals with a narrow, uninformed Western perspective ignorantly label polygyny as lustful because they're ignorant of the true purpose and benefits of polygyny. They literally don't know what polygyny is for. And ironically, some of those who criticize polygyny as lustful have themselves engaged in sexual relations with numerous people, far exceeding the numbers of partners seen in a typical polygynous relationship. In other words, there are many people in the West who have had sex with 20 plus people in their life, and yet they will claim to be monogamous. And these same people who claim to be monogamous, but they've had sex with over 10 and over 20 people, these same people will look down on polygynous men. Say there's a polygynous man with 5 wives. They'll look down on him and call him lustful, even though he's having lawful sex and he may have had far less sex partners than they have. And this all goes back to what it says on the screen here in Ecclesiasticus chapter 3, verse 24, where it says, "For many are deceived by their own vain opinion." When people call polygyny sin, they're using their own vain opinion, because you can't read that in the Bible. And it says, "An evil suspicion hath overthrown their judgment." They have an evil suspicion about polygynous men, and that overthrows their judgment. They're not able to judge righteously because they have an evil suspicion in their mind about men that have multiple wives. So they aren't able to judge righteously concerning the situation, concerning the fact that it's biblical, that it's lawful. They're too blinded by the fact that they see one man with multiple wives, and again, all they can think about is sex, because they don't even know what polygyny is for. They have a Western mind, and they don't even understand the purpose of polygyny.